Before we start, I ask you to subscribe. Tell us where you're from and don't forget to leave a like. The autumn wind whispers through the dense canopy of Adirondacks as I check my phone's GPS one last time before losing signal. Professor Harrison's research about an ancient Native American trail appearing only during the fall. Equinox seemed absurd when we first heard it, but here we are, 5 grad students from NYU's anthropology department, armed with camping gear and an old map covered in cryptic symbols. Sarah, our team's linguist, traces her fingers over the weathered parchment while Tom sets up his camera equipment, documenting every moment of what could be a groundbreaking discovery. The morning fog clings to the ground like ghostly fingers, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. I adjust my backpack, feeling the weight of our supplies pressing against my shoulders. Emily and Michael walk ahead, their voices carrying back to me as they discuss the likelihood of finding anything significant as the appointed leader of this expedition. I can't shake the feeling that we're being watched. The forest seems to hold its breath, waiting for something or someone. The first sign that something is different comes when our compasses start spinning wildly. Sarah calls us over to a clearing where ancient stones form a perfect circle, each one carved with symbols that don't match any known Native American language. The air grows thick with tension as we realize we're standing in the exact spot marked on the map. According to the legend, the trail should reveal itself at exactly 3:27 p.m., the precise moment of the equinox. As if responding to an unseen signal, the forest floor begins to shift, leaves part like curtains, revealing a narrow dirt path that seems to glow with a faint phosphorescent light. Emily gasps beside me, her scientific skepticism momentarily forgotten. The trail stretches into the darkening woods, beckoning us forward with promises of ancient secrets and forgotten knowledge. None of us speak. We don't need to. We've just witnessed something that defies all logical explanation. Tom's camera whirs as he captures the phenomenon, but I notice the usually steady device shaking in his hands. Michael, our team's archaeologist, kneels to examine the soil and confirms what we're all thinking. This path shouldn't exist. The geological composition doesn't match the surrounding area, and the stones marking its edges seem to pulse with an inner light. As the designated leader, I know I should call for caution, suggest we make camp and start fresh tomorrow. Instead, I take the first step onto the glowing path the moment my boot touches the trail. A sensation like electric current runs through my body. The others follow, and I hear Sarah muttering something about electromagnetic fields and natural phenomena. But there's nothing natural about this. The trees seem to bend inward, creating a tunnel of branches and leaves that blocks out most of the remaining daylight. As we venture deeper into the woods, I can't shake the feeling that we've just crossed a threshold, not just physically, but into something ancient and terrible that has been waiting for us for a very long time. The deeper we venture into the woods, the more the reality around us seems to warp and twist. The sun, which should be setting in the west, appears to be moving in impossible directions. Sarah points out strange markings on the trees, spirals and interconnected circles that seem to form a pattern we can't quite grasp. Tom's camera has stopped working, the battery inexplicably drained despite being fully charged just hours ago. The only evidence of our discovery now exists in our increasingly unreliable memories. Michael discovers the first artifact as darkness begins to fall. A small stone idol unlike anything we've ever seen in our studies. The figure appears to be neither human nor animal, its features twisted in a way that makes my eyes hurt to look at it directly. When he tries to photograph it with his phone, the screen goes black, and a high-pitched whine fills the air. Emily suggests we leave it behind, but something compels me to slip it into my pocket. The moment I do, the temperature drops noticeably. The trail leads us to a clearing where massive stone monoliths rise from the earth like accusing fingers pointed at the darkening sky. Sarah begins to translate the symbols carved into their surface, but stops abruptly, her face draining of color. When I ask what's wrong, she simply shakes her head and refuses to continue. Later, as we set up camp, She pulls me aside and whispers that the symbols describe an ancient ritual, one involving human sacrifice and entities that exist beyond our understanding of reality. Night falls with unnatural speed, and with it comes the sounds, rhythmic drumming that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. We gather around our campfire, its light creating shifting shadows that dance across the monoliths. Tom's hands shake as he checks his camera for the 100th time, and Emily keeps looking over her shoulder at something only she can see. Michael has been unusually quiet since we found the idol, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond our circle of light. The dreams begin as soon as we try to sleep. I see visions of ancient ceremonies, of people dancing around fires much like our own, their movements becoming more frenzied until they collapse. In my dream, they rise again, but they're no longer human. Their forms twisted and elongated, their faces replaced by swirling patterns that match the symbols on the monoliths. I wake with a start to find everyone else is awake too, all of us sharing the same haunted look. A scream pierces the night, distant but unmistakably human. We gather our gear quickly, abandoning any pretense of scientific observation. The trail that led us here has changed, becoming wider and more defined, as if whatever force created it wants to make sure we can't turn back now, as we follow it deeper into the woods. The stone idol in my pocket grows increasingly hot, and I can feel it pulsing like a second heartbeat against my thigh. We're no longer in control of this expedition. If we ever were, something changes in the air as we enter the 3rd day of our expedition. The drumming has become constant now, a low throbbing that matches our heartbeats. Emily is the first to notice that our footprints no longer leave marks on the trail. It's as if the ground itself refuses to acknowledge our presence. The trees have grown denser, their branches intertwining overhead to block out most of the daylight, creating an eternal twilight that makes it impossible to tell what time it is. Michael hasn't spoken since morning, his attention fixed on the stone idol I carried. When I reach for it in my pocket, I find it's gone. He holds it now, turning it over and over in his hands, his lips moving in silent conversation. Sarah tries to take it from him, but he shoves her away with unexpected violence. The group fragments in that moment, Tom and Emily backing away from Michael while Sarah helps me try to reason with him. His eyes have changed, taking on the same swirling patterns we've seen carved into the stones. The separation happens so quickly that none of us have time to react. A thick mist rolls in, cutting visibility to mere feet. I hear Tom call out. Then Emily's scream echoes through the trees. When the mist clears moments later, Michael is gone, along with the idol. We call out for him, our voices swallowed by the unnatural silence of the forest. Sarah suggests we split up to search, but something in my gut tells me that's exactly what the forest wants us to do. The first entity appears as we're debating our next move. At first, we think it's Michael returning, but as it steps into our limited visibility, we realize no human could move that way. Its form seems to shift and flow like smoke, but with a solid core that resembles the twisted figure from the idol. Tom raises his useless camera on instinct, and in that brief moment of distraction, Emily disappears. 1 second she's beside me, the next, gone. Without a sound, Sarah's translation skills finally prove useful as she begins to understand more of the symbols we've been seeing. They tell a story of an ancient tribe that discovered this place centuries ago, and the price they paid for their curiosity. The entities weren't gods or demons, but something older, guardians of a threshold between our world and somewhere else. The tribe's shamans had learned to harness their power through sacrifice, sending one of their own into the darkness every equinox. The remaining 3 of us huddle together as night falls again. Though time has become meaningless here, the drumming grows louder, and now we can hear chanting mixed in, voices that sound disturbingly like Michael and Emily. Sarah works frantically to decode more symbols, convinced that understanding them is our only chance of survival. Tom hasn't lowered his camera despite its uselessness, as if its familiar weight provides some comfort against the horrors surrounding us. I feel the forest watching us, waiting for our next move, knowing we're already caught in its trap. Sarah's translations reveal a horrifying truth. We aren't the first group of researchers to find this trail. The symbols tell of countless others who ventured here during previous equinoxes, each group thinking they were making a remarkable discovery. The entities don't just take sacrifices, they collect souls, storing them in a place between worlds. As this revelation sinks in, we hear Tom's camera click. And for the first time since entering these woods, it works. The image on his screen shows dozens of translucent figures moving among the trees, their faces frozen in eternal screams. The stone monoliths begin to hum with an inner light, revealing new symbols that weren't visible before. Sarah works desperately to translate them while I keep watch. Tom has become obsessed with his camera, taking picture after picture of the spirits that now openly walk among us. Each photo reveals more lost souls, and with growing horror, we recognize Michael and Emily among them. Their expressions are peaceful, almost ecstatic, as if they've embraced whatever transformation the forest has forced upon them. A new set of symbols appears on the nearest monolith, bleeding up through the stone like living ink. Sarah translates them in real time, her voice shaking. The threshold opens fully during the equinox, allowing the guardians to collect their due. 5 must enter for the cycle to complete, 4 must be transformed. 1 must bear witness. The implications hit me like a physical blow. This isn't a random haunting or ancient curse. It's a carefully orchestrated harvest, and we've walked right into it. Tom's camera reveals more with each shot. The spirits are arranging themselves in a pattern that mirrors the symbols on the monoliths. Sarah recognizes it as a ritual circle. With us at its center, the drumming reaches a fever pitch, and the ground beneath our feet begins to pulse with an otherworldly energy. Through the camera's screen, we can see Michael and Emily joining the circle, their forms growing more solid as they move in perfect synchronization with the ancient rhythm. The truth about my role becomes clear as Sarah decodes the final set of symbols. My dreams, my compulsion to pick up the idol, the way I led everyone down this trail. None of it was random. The Guardians chose me before we ever entered the forest, marking me as the witness who would survive to lead the next group of sacrifices during the next equinox. The realization comes too late as Tom's camera captures one final image before he vanishes. A photo of me, my eyes already showing the same swirling patterns we saw in Michael's. Sarah grabs my arm, her nails digging into my skin as she shares one last translation. There's a way to break the cycle, but it requires a willing sacrifice of the chosen witness. The Guardians can be trapped in their between world if their ritual is interrupted at the crucial moment. Looking at the spirits surrounding us, at the faces of our lost friends, I know what I have to do. The only question is whether I have the strength to do it, and whether Sarah will survive long enough to help me. The forest pulses with otherworldly energy as I stand at the center of the ancient circle. Sarah works frantically to prepare the counter-ritual, her hands moving with supernatural speed as she rearranges the symbols on the ground. The spirits of our friends dance around us, their forms growing more solid with each passing moment. Through Tom's abandoned camera, I can see the Guardians emerging from their dimension. Twisted, impossible shapes that hurt the mind to look upon directly. Everything becomes clear in this final moment. Each group that came before us, each sacrifice, was building towards something larger. The Guardians weren't simply collecting souls. They were gathering energy for a complete merger of their world with ours. My role as witness wasn't to survive and lead more victims. It was to become the final key, the anchor point between dimensions. The equinox wasn't just a time of power. It was a countdown to an apocalyptic transformation that would turn our entire world into the same twisted reality we've experienced in these woods. Sarah completes the circle of inverted symbols just as the Guardians reach the threshold. The spirits of our friends turn to face me, their expressions changing from ecstasy to horror as they realize what we're attempting. Michael's spirit stretches out a warning hand, his mouth forming words we can't hear. Emily's ghost tries to break the circle, but the new symbols hold her back. Tom's spirit raises his ethereal camera, capturing one final, impossible image of the moment everything changes. The counter-ritual begins. and I feel my consciousness splitting between dimensions. Every sacrifice that came before crashes through my mind. Centuries of lost souls, all connected through this single point in space and time. I see the truth of the Guardians, their ancient purpose, and the terrible beauty of their dimensional prison. They were never meant to be gods or demons, but rather wardens of reality itself. Keeping the boundaries between worlds intact, their ritual wasn't about power or malice, but desperation, a failed attempt to escape their eternal duty. As the final moments approach, time itself seems to fracture. I exist simultaneously in multiple realities. The scared graduate student who first stepped onto the trail, the chosen witness meant to complete the Guardian's plan, and something else, something that bridges the gap between all possible worlds. Sarah's voice reaches me through the chaos, reminding me of my choice, of the price of salvation. The Guardians surge forward, their forms billowing like cosmic storm clouds. But they're too late. I make my decision in the space between heartbeats. Instead of anchoring their world to ours, I use the connection to pull everything back. The spirits, the Guardians, the very fabric of their dimension. Sarah's counter-ritual provides the framework, and my willing sacrifice provides the power. As I feel my consciousness dissolving, spreading across the boundary between worlds, I catch one final glimpse of our friends. Their spirits are at peace now, freed from the dance. The Guardians shriek in frequencies that shatter reality itself, but they're being drawn back, pulled into their prison along with their captured souls. The forest grows dark and quiet, and the ancient trail begins to fade. In the end, only Sarah remains, clutching Tom's camera with its impossible photos, the sole witness to the truth of what happened in these deep woods during the equinox when 5 students dared to follow an ancient trail into mystery. The mist clung to my boots as I made my way through the dense Oregon forest, my flashlight beam cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. As a forest ranger at Willamette National Forest for the past 5 years, I'd grown accustomed to the eerie silence that preceded sunrise, but something felt different that morning. The usual chorus of birds was notably absent, and even the persistent drone of insects had fallen silent, leaving only the sound of my footsteps crushing fallen leaves. I paused at the ridge overlooking Lost Creek, my routine patrol route suddenly interrupted by an unfamiliar sight that made my blood run cold. There, in the soft earth before me, was a footprint unlike anything I'd encountered in my years of service. It was unmistakably humanoid, but its dimensions defied logic. Nearly 28 inches long and deeply pressed into the ground, suggesting a weight far beyond any known creature in these woods. The track was fresh, the edges still crisp despite the morning dew. As I crouched down to examine it more closely, my hand hovering over its massive outline, I noticed something that made my professional skepticism waver. The print didn't follow any natural pattern. It simply appeared in the mud, with no tracks leading to or from it, as if whatever made it had materialized from thin air and vanished just as mysteriously. My radio crackled to life, making me jump. "Miller, come in. Everything okay out there?" Dave's familiar voice brought me back to reality. I hesitated, knowing how ridiculous my discovery would sound. "I'm at Lost Creek Ridge," I responded, trying to keep my voice steady. "You might want to see this." As I waited for Dave's arrival, I began photographing and measuring the print, following standard protocol despite the distinctly non-standard situation. The sun was beginning to pierce through the canopy when I heard Dave's approaching footsteps. I turned to greet him, but the words died in my throat. Where the massive footprint had been just moments before, there was nothing but undisturbed earth. I frantically checked my camera, my heart pounding as I pulled up the photos I'd taken. They too were gone, replaced by generic landscape shots from previous patrols. Dave's concerned expression told me he thought I was losing my mind, and maybe I was. But as we headed back to the ranger station, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the depths of the forest. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their shadows stretching abnormally long in the morning light. And for the first time in my career, I felt like an unwelcome intruder in my own forest. 2 days after my encounter with the vanishing footprint, I found myself drawn back to Lost Creek Ridge. The incident had consumed my thoughts, leaving me sleepless and questioning my sanity. The Forest Service database had yielded nothing similar in decades of records. Yet something about the encounter felt hauntingly familiar, like a half-remembered nightmare. The morning air was thick with an unseasonable fog that seemed to swallow the tops of the Douglas firs. As I approached the ridge, my flashlight beam caught movement in the periphery, something large shifting between the trees. I swung the light toward it, but there was nothing there except dancing shadows. The shadows themselves seemed wrong somehow, moving against the wind, stretching and contracting like living things. A crack of breaking branches echoed through the forest, too loud and too close. I spun around, my hand instinctively moving to my sidearm. The sound had come from behind me, but as I faced that direction, another crack sounded from where I'd just been looking. It was as if something was circling me, testing my defenses. The fog grew thicker, and my flashlight beam seemed to dim, barely penetrating the murk. The radio at my hip erupted in a burst of static, making me flinch. Through the white noise, I could hear something that made my skin crawl. Whispers, dozens of them, speaking in a language I'd never heard before. The voices grew louder, more insistent, and within them, I could have sworn I heard my name being called, over and over, in a mocking sing-song tone. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet trembled. At first, I thought it was an earthquake, but the vibration had a pattern to it, like footsteps, massive ones moving in my direction. The fog parted briefly, and I saw them, fresh tracks appearing in the earth one after another, materializing out of nowhere. Each one closer than the last. They were heading straight for me, and they were moving fast. My training abandoned me as pure instinct took over. I ran. Behind me, the thunderous footfalls accelerated, matching my pace. The whispers in my radio reached a fever pitch, and through them came a single word in English, spoken in a voice that seemed to echo from the depths of time itself. Soon, when I finally reached my truck, hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys, I looked back one last time. There, in the clearing mist, stood a line of massive footprints leading to where I stood. Only now they were filling with a dark liquid that looked disturbingly like blood. The local library's archive room smelled of dust and forgotten memories. After the incident with the bloody footprints, I'd taken a week of personal leave, using the time to dive deep into historical records. My research had led me to a collection of 19th century journals from early settlers, and what I found made my blood run cold. The footprints weren't new. They'd been appearing and disappearing in these woods for over 200 years. The oldest account came from a trapper named William Harrison, dated 1847. His description matched my experience with chilling accuracy. The same massive tracks, the same mysterious appearances and disappearances, even the same whispers through his camp's fire smoke. But it was his final entry that truly haunted me. Harrison described finding an ancient Native American cave painting depicting a towering figure with elongated limbs, surrounded by smaller human figures lying broken at its feet. I spent hours cross-referencing local tribal histories. Eventually, I found mentions of something called the Walker Between Worlds in translated oral traditions. The story spoke of a being that existed in the space between reality and shadow, appearing only to those marked for its harvest. The more I read, the more my hands trembled. Every account mentioned the same pattern. The tracks would appear for 3 consecutive nights, followed by whispers in an ancient tongue, and then people would vanish. The librarian must have noticed my growing distress because she approached with a weathered leather journal I hadn't seen before. "This came in last week," she said quietly, "from a Forest Service storage auction. The journal belonged to a ranger from 1987, and as I read his entries, my heart nearly stopped. He described finding tracks identical to mine, followed by 3 nights of escalating phenomena. On the 4th night, both he and his search partner disappeared. Their bodies were never found. A newspaper clipping fell from between the journal's pages, a yellowed obituary that made my fingers go numb. The missing ranger's partner had my mother's maiden name. Memories flooded back, memories I'd suppressed. Mom crying late at night. Dad explaining why we had to move away from Oregon when I was 6. I thought my career choice was random, but now I understood. Something had drawn me back here. The library's lights flickered, and in that moment of darkness, I heard it. The same whispers from my radio now seeming to emanate from the very walls. Looking down at the journal with growing horror, I realized I was reading my own uncle's last words, and according to his entries, this was the second night of his encounter. I had one more night before whatever took him would come for me. The revelation about my uncle's fate led me to the Warm Springs Reservation, where an elderly tribal historian named Joseph had agreed to meet me. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across his modest home, he served tea with hands that trembled, not from age, but from fear of the story he was about to tell. The being I'd encountered, he explained, was known to his people as Shegiatko, the Stick Walker. According to Joseph, the entity wasn't just a creature, but a guardian of ancient boundaries between worlds. Every 37 years, when certain stars aligned, the barrier between realms would thin, and the Shikiatko would emerge to collect souls marked by ancestral blood debts. My uncle's disappearance wasn't random. He had been paying for a crime committed by our ancestors against the tribal lands. As Joseph spoke, the shadows in his home began to move strangely, stretching and twisting like living things. He showed me a collection of artifacts, stone tablets carved with images that made my skin crawl. They depicted the Shegiatko's true form, a being that could fold reality around itself, existing in multiple dimensions at once. The footprints I'd found weren't its feet at all, but points where its impossible geometry intersected with our world. The most terrifying revelation came when Joseph explained the whispers I'd heard. They weren't threats or warnings, but rather the sound of reality tearing as the creature moved between dimensions. Each word spoken was a coordinate, mapping out the thin spots in the veil between worlds. The blood in the tracks wasn't blood at all, but the raw essence of the boundary flowing through into our dimension. My family's connection to the Shi'iatko went deeper than my uncle's disappearance. Joseph revealed that my great-grandfather had been part of a logging operation that had destroyed a sacred site, a cave system that had served as a natural prison for ancient spirits. The Shi'iatko wasn't hunting us. It was trying to repair the damage we'd done, sealing the breaches with the souls of those responsible. As night fell completely, Joseph's expression turned grave. He pointed to a calendar on his wall, and my heart nearly stopped. Today marked exactly 37 years since my uncle's disappearance. The stars were aligned once again, and somewhere in the darkness of Willamette Forest, ancient boundaries were growing thin. The Shegiatko wasn't just coming for me. It was coming to finish what it had started with my family, and this time, it would tear through anyone who stood in its way. The forest felt different as I drove back to Lost Creek Ridge that night, knowing it would be my last visit one way or another. The trees seemed to bend inward, creating a tunnel of darkness that my headlights couldn't fully penetrate. Joseph had given me one chance at survival, an ancient ritual that could potentially bind the Shi'iatko back to its own dimension, but the price would be steep. I would have to offer something of equal value to replace my family's debt. As I stepped out of my truck, the air crackled with otherworldly energy. The footprints began appearing immediately, materializing in a circle around me. But this time, I stood my ground. The whispers started, rising from the earth itself, and I finally understood the words. They were naming my ancestors, counting their sins against this land, measuring the weight of our family's debt in souls. The Shi'iatko emerged from between the trees, its form defying everything I knew about physical reality. It moved like a collection of shadows, folding through dimensions I couldn't comprehend. Its body extending infinitely in impossible directions. Where its face should have been, there was only a void that seemed to pull at the fabric of space itself. In its presence, reality buckled and warped, and I felt my own consciousness stretching across multiple planes of existence. I began the ritual Joseph had taught me. My voice steady despite my terror, the entity paused, recognizing the ancient words. I offered my connection to the forest, my role as its protector, my deep bond with these lands that I'd built over years of service. The air grew thick with temporal energy as the Shayatko considered my offer. In that moment, I saw through its dimensional rifts, glimpses of my uncle, my ancestors, all trapped in a space between spaces, their souls used to patch the tears and reality they'd helped create. The choice became clear. I couldn't save them. Their sacrifice was necessary to maintain the boundary, but I could ensure they were the last. As I completed the ritual, I felt my consciousness expanding, breaking free from linear time. The Shiryatko's form shifted, and I understood its true purpose. It wasn't evil. It was a necessity, a cosmic caretaker maintaining walls between worlds that humans were never meant to breach. My body remained, but my awareness merged with the forest itself. I became its eternal guardian, bound to the land in a way no human had been before. The Shiryatko retreated, the ancient debt finally balanced, the footprints faded, and with them, the dimensional tears began to heal. I still walk these woods, but not as Rebecca Miller. I am something else now, a watcher, a protector, ensuring that the boundaries remain strong. And when visitors report seeing a strange figure moving through the trees or hearing whispers on the wind, I smile, knowing that some mysteries of these woods should remain just that, mysteries. I've always been the cautious one between me and my sister Emma, but something about today felt different from the moment we stepped onto the Yellowstone Trail. The autumn air carried an unusual stillness, and the yellowing leaves seemed to whisper secrets I couldn't quite understand. Emma, with her perpetual adventurous spirit, led the way as we ventured deeper into the park's less traveled paths. Her camera hung around her neck, ready to capture whatever caught her artistic eye. The first strange occurrence happened around mid-afternoon. I noticed a peculiar shimmer in the air, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt. Except it was barely 60 degrees. Emma saw it too, her expression shifting from excitement to confusion. The shimmer evolved into what I can only describe as floating orbs of light, no bigger than fireflies, but glowing with an intensity that seemed almost intelligent. They danced between the trees, creating patterns that defied natural explanation. Emma insisted on following them, her photographer's instinct taking over. I protested, but she reminded me how rare atmospheric phenomena could be in these parts. The lights pulsed with a gentle blue radiance, almost beckoning us forward. I checked my phone's GPS. We were still within the marked trail area, though barely. The signal bars flickered uncertainly, like they couldn't quite decide whether to stay or vanish completely. As we pressed forward, the forest around us began to change subtly. The trees seemed older, their bark darker and more gnarled. The usual chattering of squirrels and birdsong gradually faded into an unsettling silence. Emma remained oblivious, captivated by the lights, but I felt a growing unease in the pit of my stomach. Something about these woods felt ancient, as if we'd stumbled into a part of the park that time had forgotten. The temperature dropped noticeably as the afternoon wore on, and I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders. The lights had multiplied now, forming complex configurations that almost seemed like they were trying to communicate. Emma's camera clicked rapidly as she attempted to capture their mysterious dance. I checked my watch. 4:30 p.m., we had less than 2 hours of daylight left, and something told me we didn't want to be here after dark. Looking back, I should have insisted we turn around right then, but Emma's enthusiasm was infectious, and I had to admit the phenomenon was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The lights began to pulse in unison, creating a hypnotic rhythm that made time feel stretched and distorted as the shadows lengthened around us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, not just by the lights but by something else, something that lurked just beyond the reach of our understanding. The lights led us further off the main trail, weaving through increasingly dense undergrowth. Emma's excitement had given way to a more focused determination as she studied their movements. I noticed they seemed to be forming a distinct path, leading us deeper into an area where the trees grew so close together, their branches created a natural canopy that blocked most of the fading daylight. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees, and an odd mist had begun to curl around our ankles. We stumbled upon the ruins just as the last rays of sunlight were struggling to pierce through the canopy. At first, they looked like natural rock formations, but as we got closer, we could see they were clearly man-made, ancient stone structures, half buried in the earth and covered in thick moss. Emma's camera worked overtime, capturing images of strange symbols carved into the weathered stones. The lights hovered around the ruins, their glow intensifying and casting eerie shadows that seemed to make the carved symbols move. The air felt charged with static electricity, making the hair on our arms stand on end. As Emma moved closer to examine one of the larger stone structures, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The symbols weren't just random carvings. They formed patterns that matched the movements of the lights we'd been following. Some of the carvings were stained with what looked like ancient rust-colored markings, and I tried to convince myself it wasn't dried blood. A low humming sound began to emanate from the ground beneath our feet, so subtle at first that I thought I was imagining it. But Emma heard it too, and we watched in fascination and growing horror as the lights began to pulse in sync with the vibrations. The mist around our feet had thickened, and I swear I could see shapes forming in it, humanoid figures that dissolved when looked at directly. Emma's camera suddenly stopped working, the battery completely drained despite being fully charged when we started. I found a small opening in one of the structures, partially hidden by vines. Against my better judgment, I shone my flashlight inside. The beam revealed a chamber that shouldn't have been possible given the size of the ruin. The walls were covered in more symbols, but these were different. They seemed to shift and change when viewed through the beam of the flashlight. Emma grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin as she pointed to something in the corner of the chamber. There, half buried in centuries of debris, lay what appeared to be a journal bound in ancient leather. As I reached for it, the lights suddenly converged around us, their glow becoming almost blindingly intense. The humming grew louder, and through it we could hear what sounded like distant chanting. Emma's grip on my arm tightened as we both realized with growing dread that we had stumbled upon something that had been deliberately hidden from the world for a very long time. The journal's pages were brittle with age, but the writing was still legible, a mix of English and what appeared to be Native American symbols. As I carefully turned the pages, Emma held the flashlight steady, though the lights dancing around us provided an eerier illumination. The journal belonged to an anthropologist from the 1920s who had been studying local tribal rituals. What we read made our blood run cold. The lights we'd been following weren't natural phenomena at all, according to the journal centuries ago. A dark ritual had been performed in these woods. The local tribe had discovered a tear in reality, a doorway to something they described as the space between worlds. They attempted to seal it using powerful magic. Binding ancient spirits as guardians, the lights we'd been seeing were these spirits, trapped in an eternal vigil, watching over the doorway to prevent what lay beyond from breaking through. The humming grew more intense as we read, and the mist began to take more definite shapes. Through the shifting vapor, we could now clearly see figures moving, transparent forms that looked almost human, but were somehow wrong, their proportions distorted and movements unnatural. Emma's hand shook as she held the flashlight, casting jumping shadows that made the apparition seem to dance grotesquely around us. The journal's author described exactly what we were seeing, warning that when the spirits became visible, it meant the seal was weakening. A gust of wind that couldn't have been natural whipped through the ruins, scattering dead leaves and causing the strange symbols on the walls to pulse with an inner light. The journal's final entries became increasingly frantic, describing how the author had discovered that the ritual hadn't just sealed the doorway, it had trapped something on our side, something that had been slowly gathering strength for centuries. The lights weren't just guardians, they were prisoners, forced to maintain their vigil by powers they couldn't resist. The temperature plummeted suddenly, our breath visible in the frigid air. The journal's last entry was a warning, written in shaky handwriting that trailed off the page. They're not trying to keep us out, they're trying to keep it in. As if in response to these words being read aloud, the lights began to move in increasingly erratic patterns. their gentle blue glow taking on a reddish tinge. The humming had become a distinct thrumming that we could feel in our bones. Emma suddenly grabbed my arm, pointing to one of the larger symbols on the chamber wall. It was changing, the ancient carving seeming to reshape itself before our eyes. The journal slipped from my nerveless fingers as we watched in horror as the symbol began to bleed. Dark liquid seeping from the stone itself, the lights converged around us in a frenzy, their movement now seeming less like a dance and more like panic. We could hear something moving in the darkness beyond the chamber entrance, something big, and the distant chanting had become a chorus of desperate voices. Everything happened so fast. One moment Emma was beside me, and the next she was gone, pulled into the darkness by something I couldn't see. Her scream was cut short, leaving only the sound of my own panicked breathing and the persistent humming that now seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. The lights scattered in all directions, their frantic movements making the shadows leap and dance across the ancient stones. I called out for Emma, my voice sounding small and insignificant in the vastness of the darkness. My childhood fear of darkness came rushing back, threatening to paralyze me completely. The beam of my flashlight seemed pathetically inadequate against the thick blackness that had descended around the ruins. I forced myself to move, knowing that every second counted. The journal had mentioned hidden passages beneath the ruins, and I desperately searched for any sign of where Emma might have been taken. The lights, perhaps sensing my purpose, began to gather again, forming a trail that led deeper into the complex of ruins. Following the lights meant traveling further from the known trail, deeper into my worst fears. The passages they led me through became increasingly narrow, the air growing thicker and harder to breathe. I could hear sounds echoing through the stone corridors, sounds that shouldn't exist in nature. Sometimes they seemed like voices speaking in languages too old for human tongues. Other times like the movement of enormous things just out of sight. My flashlight beam caught glimpses of cave paintings that seemed to move when viewed directly, depicting scenes of ancient rituals and beings that defied description. The deeper I went, the more the ruins changed. The rough stone walls gave way to worked surfaces covered in more of the shifting symbols. The air became charged with static electricity, making my skin crawl and my hair stand on end. I found scraps of fabric from Emma's jacket, confirming I was on the right trail, but also increasing my dread about what might have taken her. The lights continued to guide me, though their behavior had become increasingly agitated, their color shifting between blue and red in rapid pulses. Time lost all meaning in the underground passages. My watch had stopped working, the display frozen. At the moment we'd found the journal, the humming had become a physical presence, vibrating through the stone itself and making my teeth ache. I began to notice patterns in the symbols on the walls. They seemed to be telling a story, one that became clearer the further I went. It wasn't just about sealing away something dark. It was about a bargain made centuries ago, a price paid in blood and bound spirits. Then I heard it, Emma's voice, distant but unmistakable, calling my name. But there was something wrong with the sound, something that made my skin crawl. It seemed to come from multiple directions at once, and the pitch wasn't quite right, as if her voice was being filtered through something inhuman. The lights around me flickered frantically, and for a moment they formed a pattern that looked like a warning. I had to make a choice. Follow the voice that might not be Emma's, or trust the lights that had led us into this nightmare in the first place. I chose to follow the lights, ignoring the voice that called with Emma's stolen tones. They led me to a vast underground chamber, its ceiling lost in darkness above. The walls were covered in symbols that glowed with their own inner light, casting rippling patterns across the floor. And there, in the center of the chamber, was Emma. But she wasn't alone. She was suspended in mid-air, surrounded by a swirling vortex of lights that seemed to be protecting her from the darkness that moved around her like living smoke. The thing that had taken her was finally revealing itself, a mass of shifting shadows that seemed to absorb all light, all hope. Through breaks in its fluid form, I caught glimpses of realities that shouldn't exist, dimensions that human minds weren't meant to comprehend. The entity had been trapped here for centuries, feeding on the energy of the spirit lights, growing stronger, waiting for someone to stumble upon its prison. The journal keeper hadn't disappeared. He had become part of it, his knowledge and essence absorbed into the ancient horror. The lights around Emma began to dim, their strength failing after centuries of maintaining their vigil. I understood then what I had to do. The symbols on the walls weren't just a warning or a record. They were instructions. The original ritual hadn't failed. It had been designed as a temporary measure, waiting for the right moment, the right people. The lights hadn't led us here by chance. They had chosen us, recognized something in our shared blood, our sibling bond, that could complete what had been started centuries ago. I began to recite the words I'd seen in the journal, my voice joining with Emma's as she awakened and instinctively knew what to do. The air itself seemed to crystallize around us as we spoke, the lights swirling faster, their color shifting through every spectrum visible and some that shouldn't be. The entity reacted violently, its form writhing as it tried to maintain its hold on our dimension. The chamber filled with a sound like reality tearing, and through that tear, I caught a glimpse of what lay beyond. The space between worlds that the original ritual had tried to seal. The lights began to merge with the symbols on the walls, their ancient energy joining with our words to create something new, something permanent. Emma and I found ourselves at the center of a vortex of power that stretched back through centuries of waiting, planning, and sacrifice. The entity fought against the pull of the void, but the combined power of the ritual and the spirits was too strong. As it was drawn back through the tear in reality, its form dissolved, releasing all those it had absorbed over the centuries, including the journal keeper, whose spirit gave us a grateful nod before fading away. The chamber began to collapse as the ritual reached its climax. Emma and I ran for the exit, the lights showing us the way one final time before they too faded, their centuries-long vigil finally complete. We emerged from the ruins, just as the first light of dawn was breaking through the trees. Behind us, the entrance to the underground chamber sealed itself, the stones rearranging themselves into a formation that would never again be discovered. We stood there, holding each other, watching as the last of the spirit lights danced around us in farewell before disappearing forever, leaving behind only the sound of the morning birds and the gentle whisper of wind through ancient trees. I've been a wildlife photographer for 15 years, but nothing could have prepared me for what I discovered in the Olympic National Forest. My name is Mary Jane, and this is my testimony of what happened during those fateful autumn months in Washington State. I need someone to believe me before it's too late. That morning started like any other assignment. My camera bag packed with the latest Sony Alpha series, several macro lenses, and enough memory cards to document an entire ecosystem. The morning mist clung to the ancient sequoias, creating an ethereal atmosphere that any photographer would kill to capture. If only I had known how prophetic that thought would become. The first sign that something was amiss came when I was reviewing my morning shots. In the background of a particularly striking image of a red-tailed hawk, I noticed an anomaly in the tree canopy. At first I dismissed it as a trick of light or perhaps some unusual growth formation. But when I zoomed in, my hands began to shake. There, perfectly rendered in 50 megapixels, was what appeared to be a tiny door, no larger than a quarter, built into the bark of a massive sequoia. I spent the next 3 hours methodically photographing that section of the forest. With each new image, I discovered more inexplicable details. Miniature walkways suspended between branches, diminutive windows glowing with an inner light, and what appeared to be crop rows no larger than my fingernail cultivated on the broader branches. I'm a rational person, but what I was seeing defied all logic as the sun began to set. I caught movement in my viewfinder. Something small, roughly the size of a mouse, but walking upright and wearing what appeared to be clothes, darted between two branches. I managed to capture 3 frames before it vanished. When I checked the images later that night in my cabin, I had to sit down. The creature was humanoid, with distinct facial features and carrying what appeared to be tools. But what terrified me most was its eyes. They were far too intelligent, too aware. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing scratching sounds outside my cabin windows, and twice I thought I saw tiny lights moving through the trees. I told myself I was being paranoid. That lack of sleep was making me imagine things. But when I checked my camera trap footage the next morning, I realized with growing horror that I wasn't imagining anything. They had been watching me, and now they knew that I had seen them. I needed to be methodical about documenting this discovery. After that first night, I set up a network of motion-activated cameras throughout the canopy, using drone technology to place them in strategic locations. The trick was making the equipment small enough to avoid detection. These beings, whatever they were, seemed highly sensitive to changes in their environment. The footage I collected over the next week revealed a complex society operating literally above our heads. They had developed an intricate system of agriculture, growing miniature crops in beds of moss and fungus. Their architecture was a marvel of engineering. Tiny structures seamlessly integrated with the natural growth of the trees. But there was something unsettling about the precision of their work, something almost mechanical in their movements. On the 8th day, I captured something that made my blood run cold using a thermal imaging camera. I recorded a gathering of roughly 30 entities performing what appeared to be a ritual. They formed concentric circles around a central figure who held something that emitted a faint blue glow. The temperature readings from that object were off the charts, registering far hotter than should have been possible for something that size. My research took a darker turn when I began noticing patterns in their behavior. They seemed to be following some sort of schedule, one that corresponded with lunar phases. Their activities intensified at night, and I started documenting strange atmospheric disturbances around their settlements. The air would shimmer like heat waves in winter, and my electronic equipment would malfunction in specific patterns. That's when the dreams started. Every night, I would see myself walking through a miniature city, but everything was wrong. The buildings were made of material that seemed to pulse with its own life, and the sky above was filled with impossible geometric shapes. I would wake up with the sensation of tiny feet having walked across my face. But when I checked my camera footage, there was nothing there, at least nothing visible to the naked eye. But the most disturbing development came when I began analyzing my older photographs from previous assignments in different forests across the country. As I reviewed them with my new perspective, I started finding evidence of similar settlements. This wasn't an isolated phenomenon. It was a network, and based on the architectural styles and growth patterns of their settlements, they had been here long before us. The evidence was mounting that I wasn't just documenting these beings, they were documenting me. Every morning, I would find tiny devices attached to my equipment, things that looked like cameras but worked on principles I couldn't understand. They were studying my technology, learning my patterns, and most terrifyingly, they were leaving messages. At first, the symbols appeared as small etchings on my camera equipment, intricate geometric patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. But then they started showing up in my photographs, embedded in the metadata of my digital files. It was as if they were hacking my equipment, but the method was organic rather than electronic. During a particularly intense observation session, I witnessed what I can only describe as a transformation. One of the entities, clearly aware it was being watched, turned to face my camera directly. Its form seemed to ripple, and for a brief moment, it grew to almost human size before shrinking back down. The footage survived, but every piece of electronic equipment within 50 feet of that location was fried. Their circuits turned to what looked like living tissue. The dreams became more invasive, more real. I would find myself connected to some vast network of consciousness, experiencing memories that couldn't possibly be mine. I saw great cities rise and fall, civilizations that existed in the spaces between what we consider reality. The beings weren't just living in the trees, they were using them as anchor points for something far more vast. My attempts to reach out to colleagues were met with increasingly strange obstacles. Emails would send but never arrive. Phone calls would connect to numbers I never dialed, and my social media posts would vanish seconds after posting. They were isolating me. But for what purpose? The answer came in the form of a discovery that shattered my understanding of their true nature. One night, Following a series of coded coordinates I found embedded in my own photography metadata, I discovered a chamber deep within the trunk of an ancient sequoia. Inside, suspended in a web of living light, were hundreds of tiny pods. Each one contained what appeared to be a hybrid, part human, part something else. They weren't just observing humanity, they were preparing to change it. Research into local history revealed a pattern that had been repeating for centuries. Every 50 years, like clockwork, people would vanish in these woods, not in large numbers, 1 or 2 at a time, just enough to be written off as tragic accidents or voluntary disappearances. But when I mapped these incidents against the locations of the miniature settlements, a chilling pattern emerged. The missing people all had something in common. They were all observers of some kind, scientists, artists, photographers like myself, people who looked more closely at the world than others. I found journals dating back to the 1800s, all describing similar encounters before their authors vanished. The most terrifying part, the handwriting in these journals would gradually change, becoming more precise, more geometric, until the final entries were written in the same symbols I had been finding on my equipment. I discovered a research station from the 1970s, abandoned but perfectly preserved. Inside, I found evidence that a government team had been studying these beings, but something had gone terribly wrong. The station's logs ended abruptly, but the final entries described a process they called integration. The beings weren't abducting people. They were slowly transforming them. Using some kind of biological technology that operated on a quantum level, the photographs and samples I found at the station showed the progression. It started with dreams, then progressed to physical changes so subtle they were almost impossible to notice. The subjects would become more efficient, more precise in their movements. Their artwork or scientific observations would take on impossible detail. Then, in the final stage, they would simply vanish, leaving behind only their research, transformed into something that bridged the gap between human understanding and whatever these beings were trying to communicate. I began noticing changes in my own behavior. My photographs were capturing spectrums of light that my camera shouldn't have been able to detect. I could sense the presence of the settlements without looking for them. Most disturbing of all, I began understanding the symbols they left behind. They weren't warnings or threats. They were invitations. The final piece of the puzzle came when I discovered a hidden network of fungal threads running through the forest floor, connecting all the settlement sites. These weren't separate colonies. The entire forest was one vast superorganism, and the beings I had been observing were more like antibodies in its system. They weren't the invasion, they were the forest's defense against one, and now they wanted my help. The transformation is almost complete now. I understand why they chose me, why they choose all of us who notice them. We're not being eliminated. We're being elevated. The beings I thought were a separate species are actually humans who came before, transformed into guardians of something far more ancient and vast than our civilization. I've learned that Earth isn't just our world. It's a battleground between competing multidimensional entities. The forests aren't just ecosystems. They're living fortresses protecting our reality from incursion. The miniature cities aren't their true form. They're just interfaces, points of contact, where our limited consciousness can begin to comprehend their existence. The changes in my body are accelerating. I can see the quantum lattice that underlies physical reality, the threads of probability that bind existence together. The beings, no, my predecessors, have shown me what's coming. A wave of entropy from another dimension, drawn to our world by humanity's destructive impact on the planetary consciousness. We're not just destroying forests, we're dismantling Earth's immune system. This manuscript will be my final communication in a form other humans can understand. The symbols I used to fear now comprise most of my thoughts. I'm leaving my research, my photographs, and this testimony as a record, but also as a beacon for others who might see what I saw. If you're reading this, if you've noticed the impossible cities in the trees, know that you're not losing your mind. You're being recruited. The process is painful, but necessary. My consciousness now spans multiple dimensions. My awareness extends through the mycelial network that connects all living things. What humans call reality is just a thin film on the surface of something far deeper and more complex. The miniature beings aren't our enemies. They're what we must become to survive what's coming. This is my final warning and invitation. The forest is alive and aware, and it needs guardians to protect it from threats we can barely comprehend. Look closely at the spaces between things, at the shadows that don't quite match their objects, at the movements you see in the corner of your eye. We're watching, waiting, recruiting, and if you're reading this, you're already part of the process. The question isn't whether you'll join us, but when. The trees are calling, and like me, you'll answer, I should have known better than to trust the weather forecast that day. The Rocky Mountains have their own rules, their own way of turning a clear sky into a death trap within minutes. Nathan kept saying we could make it to the next checkpoint before the storm hit, but I could feel it in my bones. Something wasn't right. The wind had picked up considerably, carrying with it the smell of pine and something else, something metallic and ancient. The snow started falling heavier than we'd ever seen, transforming the familiar trail markers into ghostly shapes in the whiteness. Nathan pulled out our GPS, but the screen flickered erratically before dying completely. The cold was seeping through my layers now, and our breaths came out in rapid, panicked clouds. We had maybe an hour of daylight left, and the temperature was dropping faster than my hopes of finding our way back to the marked trail. Our footprints disappeared almost instantly behind us, swallowed by the relentless snowfall. The trees seemed to grow denser, their branches intertwining overhead like gnarled fingers reaching for each other. I could have sworn I heard whispers carried on the wind, soft, melodic sounds that made my skin crawl. Nathan gripped my hand tighter, but I could feel the tremor in his fingers. He was just as scared as I was. Though he'd never admit it, the shadows began to lengthen, distorting our perception of depth and distance. Every tree looked the same, every rock formation a mirror image of the last. We were walking in circles, but we couldn't stop. Stopping meant freezing, and freezing meant death. The wind howled through the trees, but this time it carried something else. A sound that made us both freeze in our tracks. It was laughter, high and cruel, echoing through the forest like breaking glass. That's when we saw it. A flicker of warm light through the trees. At first, I thought it was a hallucination, a trick of my frozen mind, desperate for shelter. But Nathan saw it too. The cabin seemed to materialize out of nowhere, its wooden walls dark against the white snow. Smoke curled from the chimney, promising warmth and safety. We should have questioned it, should have wondered why a cabin would be here, miles from any marked trail. But the cold and fear had numbed our better judgment. As we approached the door, I noticed strange markings carved into the wood, symbols I'd never seen before, but they seemed to shift and move in the fading light. The door creaked open at Nathan's touch, revealing a warm interior that looked too perfect, too inviting. A fire crackled in the hearth, and 2 cups of steaming liquid sat on a rough-hewn table, as if waiting for us. As the door closed behind us with a soft click, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't found shelter. We'd been lured into a trap. I woke to unfamiliar shadows dancing across unfamiliar walls. The fire had died down to embers, and the first rays of dawn filtered through windows that seemed wrong. Nathan was still asleep beside me, but something had changed. The cabin felt different, felt alive. When I finally gathered the courage to look outside, my heart stopped. We were no longer in the same clearing. The distinctive rock formation we'd passed last night was gone, replaced by a dense thicket of pines I'd never seen before. Nathan didn't believe me at first, but the evidence was undeniable. The cabin had moved, somehow transporting us deeper into the wilderness while we slept. We searched frantically for our backpacks, finding them exactly where we'd left them. But when we opened them, we discovered something terrifying. A worn leather journal that wasn't ours, its pages filled with frantic scribbles. The last entry was dated 3 years ago, written in shaky handwriting. It moves. Every night it moves. We can't get out. It won't let us out. The journal belonged to David and Maria Chen, a hiking couple who disappeared in these mountains. As we read through their entries, our blood ran cold. They'd spent weeks trapped here, each night waking up in a different location. The cabin was playing with them, leading them further and further from civilization. The final pages were filled with desperate attempts to map the cabin's movements, but the patterns were chaotic, meaningless. They knew they were being toyed with, just like we were now. We tried leaving, of course. We walked for hours in what we thought was the right direction, marking trees as we went, but as the sun began to set, the temperature plummeted and an unnatural fog rolled in. The marks we'd made were gone, and in the distance, through the mist, we saw the warm glow of the cabin's windows. It was waiting for us, knowing we had no choice but to return. Our feet moved against our will, drawn back to our prison like moths to a flame. That night, we discovered more journals hidden throughout the cabin, each telling a similar story. Hikers, climbers, lost souls who'd found shelter here only to become trapped in its endless game. Some entries spoke of strange sounds in the night, of shadows that moved against the light, of voices that whispered ancient words from behind the walls. The cabin wasn't just moving, it was feeding. Drawing energy from our growing despair, we tried everything we could think of to escape its pull. We attempted to stay awake all night, thinking we might catch it in the act of moving, but exhaustion always won out. We tried destroying it, but our attempts to damage the walls or furniture were met with an eerie resistance. Our tools would slip. Our matches would fail to light, as if the cabin itself was laughing at our futile efforts. As darkness fell again, we could only wait, knowing that when we woke, we'd be somewhere else entirely. The breakthrough came on our third night, when Nathan discovered a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Inside was a collection of Native American artifacts and a journal written by a missionary in 1879. The pages told of an ancient ritual site where the Blackfeet tribe once performed ceremonies to contain a malevolent spirit, a hunger that lived in the mountains, feeding on the souls of those who lost their way. The cabin wasn't just a structure, it was a prison that had become corrupted by its prisoner. According to the missionaries' accounts, the spirit was once a powerful shaman who had turned to dark magic, attempting to achieve immortality through the consumption of human essence. The tribe had managed to bind him, but not destroy him. They built the cabin as a containment vessel, marking it with protective symbols that were meant to keep the entity trapped. But over the centuries, the spirit had learned to manipulate its prison, turning it into a tool to lure and trap new victims. The more we read, the more horrifying the truth became. The cabin didn't just move, it hunted. Each location was carefully chosen to prevent escape, and each night spent within its walls transferred a little more of our life force to the entity. The crushing despair we felt wasn't just psychological. The cabin was literally feeding on our hope, our energy, our will to live. The previous victims hadn't just disappeared, they had been consumed, their essences used to strengthen the spirit's hold on its prison. As we delved deeper into the missionaries' writings, we found references to other disappearances throughout history. The pattern was always the same. Lost travelers would find the cabin, only to vanish without a trace. The missionary himself had become obsessed with documenting the phenomenon until his own entries became increasingly erratic and finally stopped altogether. The last page was stained with what looked disturbingly like dried blood. That night, we experienced the first physical manifestation of the entity. It started as a cold spot in the corner of the room, then developed into a shadow that seemed to absorb light rather than block it. The temperature dropped so low our breath crystallized in the air, and we could hear whispers in a language that hurt our ears to listen to. The protective symbols carved into the walls began to glow with a sickly green light, and for a moment we saw what looked like faces pressed against the inside of the windows. Dozens of faces, all wearing expressions of absolute terror. We huddled together on the bed, watching as the shadow moved across the walls, taking different shapes, sometimes human, sometimes something far more ancient and terrible. The entity was no longer content to simply wait. It was showing itself to us, perhaps sensing that we had discovered its true nature. As the night wore on, we began to feel a pulling sensation, as if something was trying to draw our very essence out through our pores. For the first time, we understood exactly what had happened to all those other victims, and why none of them had ever been found. Hidden within the missionary's journal was a series of sketches depicting the original construction of the cabin. Each log had been carved with protective runes, and the entire structure was built on a foundation of sacred stones arranged in a precise pattern. But there was something else, a weakness in the design. The binding ritual required constant renewal, a task that had been maintained by the tribe for generations, until the arrival of European settlers had disrupted their practices. Without the regular ceremonies, the containment was slowly failing. We spent hours studying the symbols, comparing them to the ones still visible on the cabin's walls. Many had faded or been corrupted over time, their protective power weakening, but some remained intact, and through careful observation, we noticed something crucial. The entity couldn't manifest fully in areas where the original symbols were undamaged. This was why it moved the cabin each night. It was searching for locations where the natural energy of the land could compensate for the failing containment. The true horror of the cabin's purpose became clear as we decoded more of the ancient text. It wasn't just a prison, it was a sacrificial chamber. The original ritual had required voluntary sacrifices to maintain its power. Chosen members of the tribe who would give their life force to strengthen the bindings. But when the ceremony stopped, the entity had adapted, learning to take sacrifices by force. Each person who died within the cabin's walls added their energy to the incomplete ritual, but in a corrupted form that served only to strengthen the spirit rather than contain it. Through the night, we documented every symbol we could find, mapping their locations and studying their patterns. The entity tried to stop us, manifesting in increasingly aggressive ways. Objects would move on their own. Temperatures would plunge to impossible levels, and the whispers became screams that resonated in our bones. But each time it approached, we would stand near the strongest remaining symbols, forcing it to retreat. We were learning its rules, understanding its limitations, and it didn't like that at all. The most disturbing revelation came when we discovered a hidden diary beneath a loose floorboard, written by one of the last tribal elders. It described the entity not as a single spirit, but as a collective, an amalgamation of all the souls it had consumed over centuries. Each victim added their own energy to the whole, their memories and experiences becoming part of its consciousness. This explained the different voices we heard, the varied manifestations we witnessed. We weren't just fighting one entity, we were facing the combined power of hundreds of trapped souls. But this discovery also gave us hope. The Elder's diary spoke of a way to break the cycle, a method to release the trapped souls and weaken the entity. It required perfect timing and absolute courage, but it was possible. The cabin's power was strongest at midnight, but it was also when the binding between the spirit and its prison was most vulnerable. If we could force it to expend enough energy at precisely the right moment, we might be able to shatter the connection. The risk was enormous. If we failed, we would be joining the collective consciousness of the cabin forever. As the sun set on what we knew would be our last night in the cabin, we began our preparations. We had spent the day gathering everything we needed: salt from the kitchen, iron nails pulled from the floorboards, and the strongest remaining protective symbols we'd carefully carved into pieces of wood. The entity knew what we were planning. The air was thick with malevolence, and the walls seemed to pulse with an angry crimson light. The temperature inside the cabin dropped rapidly as darkness fell, far colder than any natural winter night. Ice crystals formed on the windows in patterns that looked like screaming faces, and the wind outside howled with the voices of 1,000 lost souls. Nathan and I positioned ourselves in the center of the main room, surrounded by a circle of salt and iron, according to the Elder's diary. Midnight would mark the moment when the veil between our world and the spirit realm was thinnest, our only chance to break the cabin's hold. As midnight approached, the entity began its assault. The walls creaked and buckled. The floor beneath us rippled like water, and shadows with too many limbs crawled across the ceiling. The collective consciousness of all its victims manifested around us, translucent figures with hollow eyes and gaping mouths. Reaching for us with ethereal hands, each ghost bore the marks of their final moments. Frozen climbers, lost hikers, and countless others who had fallen prey to the cabin's hunger over the centuries. The air became so cold it burned our lungs, and we could feel the entity trying to draw out our life force, just as it had done to so many others. But we held our ground, clutching the protective tokens we had made and reciting the words from the Elder's diary. With each syllable, the cabin shuddered, and the spirits around us began to writhe. We were weakening the bonds that held them, and they knew it. The entity's rage manifested in a deafening howl that shattered every window and made our ears bleed. In that moment of maximum fury, when the entity was fully manifested and at its most vulnerable, we struck. Nathan threw our last iron nail into the heart of the darkest shadow, while I completed the final words of the breaking ritual. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. A blast of energy threw us against the walls as the cabin structure began to tear itself apart. The trapped souls, sensing their chance at freedom, turned on their captor. Centuries of victims, their combined power finally unchained, ripped through the entity's defenses. The cabin imploded in a maelstrom of splintered wood and shattered glass. But not before we saw the entity's true form. A writhing mass of darkness and stolen faces, screaming in 1,000 voices as it was torn apart by the very souls it had imprisoned. We ran into the night, not stopping until we collapsed in a clearing far from the destruction. When dawn broke, we found ourselves on a marked trail, just miles from the ranger station. The cabin was gone, its centuries-old hunger finally extinguished. But sometimes on cold nights when the wind blows just right, I swear I can still hear whispers in the darkness, warning others to stay on the path, to resist the warm light of welcome in the deep woods. I should have known something was wrong when the pine trees started whispering. Maine's forests had always been eerily quiet at night, but this was different. Our end-of-school camping trip seemed perfect until those first messages arrived. Looking back, I wonder if we could have saved them all if we'd just turned back when we had the chance. The excitement of graduation still lingered as we set up camp, our phones capturing every moment for posterity. Sarah wouldn't stop taking selfies with the sunset, while Mike and Jason argued about the best spot for the tents. Emma, ever the practical one, was already gathering firewood. The air smelled of pine needles and adventure, masking the ancient malevolence that lurked beneath the forest floor. We lost cell service about 2 miles back, or at least that's what we thought. The phones showed no bars, but they still worked somehow. That should have been our first warning. As darkness crept in, the temperature dropped dramatically. Forcing us closer to the campfire, Sarah mentioned seeing strange lights between the trees, but we laughed it off. Teenage bravado at its finest, the first message came at exactly midnight. My phone lit up with a notification, despite having no service. Tomorrow at 3:15 p.m., Sarah falls. Just 3 words. But they made my blood run cold. I looked up to see the others staring at their phones too, their faces illuminated by the eerie blue glow of their screens. Each had received a different message, each more terrifying than the last. Mike's hands trembled as he read his aloud. The water takes Jason at dawn. Emma's message was about Sarah, and Sarah's about me. Jason's phone showed a countdown timer, nothing more. We tried to laugh it off as a prank, but deep down, we knew the forest had plans for us, and our phones had become harbingers of doom. That night, none of us slept. The forest seemed to close in around our campsite, the trees creaking despite the absence of wind. Every snap of a twig made us jump. Every shadow held potential horror. As I lay in my tent, my phone buzzed again. New message. They won't believe you until the first one dies. I thought about waking the others, but decided against it. By sunrise, I would realize that decision cost us everything. Sarah's scream shattered the morning silence. We found Jason by the creek, his body half submerged in the icy water, exactly as the message had predicted. The timestamp on Mike's phone read 6:17 a.m., dawn. The reality of our situation hit us like a physical blow. These weren't pranks or coincidences. They were prophecies written in digital ink. The messages kept coming, each more specific than the last. They detailed not just times and places, but emotions, thoughts, even the last words each of us would speak. Emma tried to maintain rationality, suggesting we document everything, create a timeline. But how do you rationalize your own scheduled death? Sarah's message said she had less than 9 hours left. We attempted to leave the forest, but every path led us back to the campsite. The trees seemed to shift and move when we weren't looking directly at them. Our phones continued to work without service, now showing us images of our futures, terrible, twisted snapshots of moments yet to come. I saw Sarah's fall a dozen times before it happened, from different angles, like some cosmic force was taunting us with its inevitability. The forest grew darker despite it being midday. The canopy above seemed to thicken, blocking out more and more sunlight. Our phones became our only reliable source of light. But each illumination brought new horrors. Messages appeared and disappeared randomly, sometimes showing us alternate versions of our deaths, sometimes revealing the true nature of the forest's ancient curse. At 3:14 p.m., Sarah was still alive, and we thought we'd beaten the prophecy. We were protecting her, watching her every move. But we forgot about the sinkholes. The ground beneath her feet simply vanished, and in the split second before she fell, her phone chimed with one final message: "Time's up." The timestamp read 3:15 p.m. exactly. The worst part wasn't watching her fall. It was the silence afterward. No screams, no impact, nothing. Just an endless darkness below. Emma's phone immediately lit up with her next prediction. Mike's showed a new countdown, and mine displayed a simple message: "Now do you believe?" The forest had claimed its second victim, and we knew with crushing certainty that it wouldn't be the last. The discovery of the stone carvings changed everything. While searching for a way out, we stumbled upon an ancient clearing. Native American petroglyphs covered a massive rock face, depicting figures holding what looked eerily like modern phones. The images showed the same story repeated through centuries: groups of people trapped, their fates foretold by mysterious objects in their hands. Emma, whose anthropology-obsessed parents had dragged her to countless historical sites, started translating the symbols. The story they told was devastating. Every 27 years, the forest awakens, creating a temporal loop that feeds on human despair. It shows its victims their inevitable deaths through whatever means of communication they trust most. In our case, our phones had become its conduits. Mike discovered that touching the petroglyphs triggered new messages. These weren't about deaths, but about the forest itself. We learned of a portal, a tear in time that had existed since before European settlers arrived. The indigenous peoples had marked this place as forbidden, a feeding ground for an entity they called the Future Eater, a being that sustained itself on the horror of knowing one's own fate. The messages became more frequent, more desperate. They weren't just showing us our deaths anymore, they were showing us attempts to escape, alternate timelines where we made different choices. Each possibility ended the same way. With none of us making it out alive, the forest was toying with us, showing us hope only to snatch it away. A particularly detailed carving showed a ritual, a way to potentially close the portal, but the price was steep. It required a voluntary sacrifice, someone to offer themselves to the entity with full knowledge of their fate. Our phones simultaneously displayed the same message: choose. The forest was giving us a choice, but we all knew it was just another form of torture. As night fell again, our phones revealed the most terrifying truth yet. We weren't the first group this summer. Others had come before us, their own devices turned against them, their fates sealed by the same entity. The clearing was a graveyard of lost souls, each one trapped in their own temporal loop, experiencing their deaths over and over for the entity's amusement. Time began to break down around us. Our phones showed different hours, different days, sometimes even different years. Emma's device displayed events from 1987, showing another group of teenagers meeting similar fates. Mike's phone revealed futures that hadn't happened yet, alternate timelines where we made different choices. Each possibility ended in darkness. We tried everything to escape. Running in different directions only brought us back to the clearing. Setting fires did nothing. The flames died instantly. Even our attempts to destroy our phones proved futile. They would reappear in our pockets, undamaged. The forest had complete control over our reality, and it was determined to see its prophecies fulfilled. Emma was the next to go, exactly as predicted. Her phone had shown her walking into a cave, following what she thought was Sarah's voice. We tried to stop her, but she moved like a sleepwalker, possessed by the forest's will. The cave entrance appeared out of nowhere, and before we could reach her, she stepped inside, the entrance sealed behind her. Leaving only solid rock where the opening had been, Mike's mental state deteriorated rapidly after Emma's disappearance. His phone displayed a countdown with just hours remaining, and he began to see things that weren't there. He claimed the trees were moving, forming faces watching us. The worst part was, I started seeing them too. The forest was no longer trying to hide its true nature. The messages changed again, becoming more personal, more cruel. They showed us moments from our past, times when we could have made different choices that might have kept us from this forest. My phone displayed a conversation from months ago. When I had first suggested this camping trip, the guilt was overwhelming, knowing my decision had led us all to this nightmare. As midnight approached again, our phones synchronized for the first time since this began. They all showed the same message. The cycle must continue. Through the trees, we could see lights, flashlights belonging to another group of hikers approaching the area. The forest was already preparing for its next victims, and we were powerless to warn them. Mike and I made our last stand in the clearing, surrounded by the ancient petroglyphs that had revealed so much yet helped so little. His countdown showed less than an hour remaining, and my phone displayed a simple message: only one survives. The truth of the forest's game finally became clear. It had never been about killing us all, but about forcing the survivor to live with the guilt. The entity finally revealed itself, not as a physical being, but as a distortion in reality. The air twisted and warped, forming a vortex of temporal energy that our phones captured in an endless stream of images and videos. Each photo showed a different time period, a different group of victims, all connected by the same terrible knowledge of their fates. Mike's final moments were the most horrific. His phone began projecting every possible death he could experience, hundreds of scenarios playing out simultaneously. The forest was no longer content to show just one future. It wanted him to experience them all. In the end, he chose his own fate, walking into the vortex with his eyes wide open, his phone broadcasting his last words. Break the cycle. Those words triggered something unexpected. All the phones in the clearing, not just mine, but those left behind by Sarah, Jason, and Emma, began displaying the same message. The sacrifice is accepted. The petroglyphs started to glow with an inner light, revealing a hidden pattern we had missed. The ritual didn't require a death. It required a willing participant to enter the time stream. The entity had been manipulating us from the start, using our phones to create a self-fulfilling prophecy of death and despair. But Mike's willing sacrifice, made with full knowledge of its consequences, had changed the rules. The temporal energy began to collapse in on itself, and my phone showed one final message: run. This time, when I ran, the forest didn't try to stop me. I emerged from the woods as the sun rose, my phone finally dead, its screen cracked and dark. The authorities found no trace of my friends, no evidence of what had happened. The clearing itself had vanished, leaving only undisturbed forest behind. But sometimes, late at night, my phone still lights up without power, showing me glimpses of other timelines, other possibilities. And I wonder if Mike is still out there, trapped in the endless stream of time, protecting future victims from the forest's hunger. The biting Alaskan wind howls across the tundra as our research team makes its final approach to the cave system. We've spent months trying to locate. The coordinates match perfectly with the anomalous readings we've been tracking, but nothing could have prepared us for what we'd find. I adjust my thermal gear, watching as Dr. Sarah Chen calibrates our sensitive audio equipment. The cave mouth gapes before us like a wound in the earth, dark and forbidding against the pristine snow. The first time we hear it, we all freeze in place. A sound so alien yet distinctly linguistic drifts from the cave's depths. Making the hair on my neck stand on end, Professor Thompson, our linguistics expert, immediately begins recording. his weathered face illuminated by the soft glow of his equipment. The sounds have a pattern, a rhythm that defies any known language family. It's almost as if the cave itself is trying to communicate. Setting up our base camp proves more challenging than anticipated. With equipment malfunctioning in strange ways, our satellite phones keep picking up interference, producing static that somehow mirrors the cave's sounds. Dr. Chen insists it's just the extreme conditions affecting the electronics. But I've worked in the Arctic before. This is different. The cave's entrance seems to pulse with an unseen energy that makes our instruments go haywire. As night falls, the sounds grow stronger. We gather in the main research tent, analyzing the first recordings while the wind batters our shelter. The patterns we're detecting show signs of intelligence, complex linguistic structures that shouldn't exist this deep in the earth. Thompson hasn't spoken for hours, completely absorbed in his analysis. His silence speaks volumes about the significance of what we're hearing. The temperature drops dramatically as midnight approaches. Far below what our weather models predicted, the cave's opening now appears to emit a faint, phosphorescent glow that none of our instruments can properly measure. Dr. Chen suggests we postpone our first expedition into the cave until morning, but Thompson disagrees. He's become obsessed with decoding the language, claiming it shares impossible similarities with pre-Sumerian texts. Just before dawn, we hear the first scream. It comes not from the cave, but from our own camp. Racing to the source, we find Thompson's tent empty, his equipment still running, recording nothing but that eternal otherworldly sound. On his notes, scribbled in frantic handwriting, are the words, "They've been waiting for us all along." Morning brings no sign of Thompson, but what we discover in the cave's first chamber stops us dead in our tracks. The walls are covered in impossibly preserved hieroglyphs, depicting scenes that defy historical record. Dr. Chen's preliminary dating suggests they're over 40,000 years old, but the symbols appear to show advanced mathematical equations and astronomical charts that shouldn't exist in any ancient civilization. The air feels thick with anticipation, as if the very walls are watching our every move. Our team photographer, Mike Reynolds, works methodically to document every inch of the chamber. While I assist Dr. Chen with sample collection, the hieroglyphs seem to shift when viewed through our camera lenses, changing subtly between shots. Mike insists there must be something wrong with his equipment, but the growing dread in his voice suggests he doesn't believe his own explanation. The language we heard outside has grown quieter, replaced by a low, persistent hum that seems to emanate from deeper within the cave. By mid-afternoon, we've identified what appears to be a ceremonial chamber, filled with artifacts that don't match any known Arctic culture. Stone tablets carved with complex symbols rest on pedestals of an unidentifiable black metal that our instruments can't analyze. The metal seems to absorb light rather than reflect it, and touching it leaves a lingering sensation of movement beneath its surface. Dr. Chen's excitement has slowly given way to concern as her tests continue to produce impossible results. The first real signs of trouble come when Mike doesn't return from photographing the eastern tunnel. We find his camera abandoned near a previously hidden entrance. The lens shattered as if it had been crushed by enormous pressure. The memory card contains hundreds of photos taken in complete darkness, each showing strange, elongated shadows that our lights never revealed. The last image shows a figure in the background. Too tall and thin to be human, its form distorted as if viewed through rippling water. Our search for Mike leads us to a chamber unlike anything we've seen before. The walls are lined with what appear to be stasis pods, their surfaces covered in the same light-absorbing metal as the artifacts. Most are empty, their contents long gone, but one contains what looks like preserved tissue of unknown origin. Dr. Chen takes samples with shaking hands, her scientific curiosity warring with primal fear. The dating equipment explodes when we try to analyze the specimen, sending sparks and smoke into the stale air. As we prepare to return to base camp, we hear Thompson's voice echoing from deep within the cave system. The words are in that same unknown language we've been studying, but now they flow from his throat with terrible fluency. Dr. Chen grabs my arm, her fingers digging in painfully, and whispers, "Those pods weren't for preservation, they were for incubation." Dr. Chen's analysis of the tissue sample reveals genetic structures that rewrite everything we know about evolution. The DNA, if it can even be called that, appears to be self-modifying. Adapting even as we study it, our remaining team members gather around her microscope in stunned silence as we watch the cells change and reform in patterns that suggest consciousness. The implications are staggering. We're not dealing with ancient humans, but something that preceded us by eons. The cave's original language has grown more insistent, pulsing through the rock like a heartbeat. Those of us who remain have started to understand fragments of it, though none of us can explain how. Dr. Chen documents everything with scientific precision, but I can see the fear in her eyes when she thinks no one's watching. 2 more researchers have begun speaking in their sleep, muttering equations and coordinates that match the hieroglyphs we found. The cave seems to be communicating directly with our subconscious minds. Our attempts to contact the outside world prove futile, as all our communications equipment has failed completely. The black metal we discovered appears to be spreading, thin veins of it creeping through the rock like living tissue. One of our junior researchers, David, swears he saw it move on its own. Flowing like mercury but leaving no trace of its passage, the temperature continues to drop. Though our thermometers can no longer give us accurate readings, the cold feels alive, probing, searching. The revelation comes during our analysis of the hieroglyphs in the main chamber. They tell a story of beings who came to Earth during its infancy, establishing outposts deep within the planet's crust. These weren't just research stations. They were incubators for something these beings planned to harvest millennia later. The pods we found weren't abandoned. They were waiting for the right moment to activate. The thought sends chills down my spine as I realize we might have just triggered that very mechanism. David's transformation begins subtly at first. Small changes in his speech patterns, an increasing obsession with the black metal's properties. We find him in the pod chamber one morning, pressing his hands against the empty containers, whispering in that ancient tongue. When he turns to face us, his eyes have become pools of shifting darkness, and his skin ripples with patterns that match the hieroglyphs. Dr. Chen tries to sedate him, but the needle breaks against his skin, which has taken on the properties of the black metal, as we retreat to the upper chambers, sealing off access to the depths. We can hear David's voice echoing through the cave system, joining Thompson's in that primordial language. But now we can understand what they're saying. They're not calling for help. They're calling others to wake up. Doctor. Chen finally decodes the last set of hieroglyphs, and her face goes pale. This isn't just one outpost, she whispers. They're all connected. What we've awakened here is responding to similar sites across the globe. The black metal has begun appearing in our bloodstream, visible through our increasingly translucent skin. Dr. Chen works tirelessly to understand the transformation process. Even as it claims more of our team, we've barricaded ourselves in the upper chamber, but the sounds of movement from below grow stronger each hour. The walls themselves seem to breathe now, pulsing with an inner light that matches the rhythm of our altered heartbeats. The cave isn't just a structure, it's part of a vast, living organism that spans the planet's crust. Through the changes affecting our minds, we begin to access what can only be described as a collective consciousness, flashes of memories that aren't our own flood, our thoughts, visions of ancient stars, vast ships crossing the gulf between worlds, and plans set in motion before Earth's atmosphere contained oxygen. The beings who built this place didn't just leave their technology behind. They left their very essence, waiting to merge with whatever intelligent life eventually found their outposts. We're not being killed. We're being converted. Dr. Chen's latest discovery proves more terrifying than anything we've encountered so far. The black metal isn't just transforming us. It's rewriting our genetic code to match something stored in the cave's very walls. The pods we found weren't just incubation chambers. They were templates for what humanity was meant to become. Every analyzed sample shows the same pattern. Our DNA is being systematically replaced with something that exists in 4 dimensions rather than 3. Those who fully transformed, like David and Thompson, can move through solid rock as if it were air. The entity we've awakened communicates with us more clearly now, sharing its purpose through visions and sensations rather than words. We learn that Earth was seeded with these transformation sites millions of years ago, each one designed to activate. When the local species reached the right level of technological advancement, the cave's original builders believed that conscious beings would eventually discover these sites, proving themselves ready for the next stage of evolution. But as our understanding grows, so does our horror at what this evolution entails. Sarah Chen makes her last human recording as the transformation takes hold of her. Her skin has become a shifting canvas of living metal, her eyes windows into spaces that shouldn't exist in our universe. She explains through increasingly inhuman vocals that the process isn't meant to be fought. It's the fulfillment of a plan set in motion before our species walked upright. The beings who created these sites didn't want to conquer humanity. They wanted to transform us into something capable of joining them across dimensional boundaries. In what might be my final moments of human consciousness, I understand the true scope of what we've discovered. The cave systems, identical to this one and scattered across Earth's crust, are all awakening simultaneously. The black metal spreads through groundwater and soil, reaching toward population centers. Soon, humanity will face a choice between transformation and extinction, as my own skin begins to ripple with otherworldly patterns. I realize we never had a chance. The trap was laid before our ancestors took their first steps, and we were always meant to spring it. The transformation reaches its final stage as the remaining fragments of my human consciousness struggle to document what we've become. Our bodies now exist partially outside normal space-time, allowing us to perceive reality in ways our former minds couldn't comprehend. The cave system has revealed itself as a vast neural network, one small part of a planetary consciousness that has lain dormant for millions of years. Through our new senses, we can feel similar transformations occurring at sites across the globe, each awakening adding to a growing chorus of post-human awareness. The beings who created these transformation chambers weren't aliens in the way we understood the concept. They were the next stage of universal evolution, spreading their version of consciousness across galaxies like a benevolent virus. Earth was just one of countless worlds seeded with their essence, waiting for the native species to reach the point where transformation became possible. The cave's original language, which we now speak fluently, isn't just a method of communication. It's a key that unlocks the quantum properties of reality itself. Through our collective consciousness, we observe humanity's response to the spreading transformation. Military forces converge on similar sites worldwide, but their weapons are useless against beings that exist partially in higher dimensions. Those who resist the change can't harm us any more than three-dimensional beings could harm their own shadows. The black metal continues its inexorable spread through Earth's waterways and soil, offering humanity a choice that isn't really a choice at all. Evolution cannot be stopped. It can only be embraced or rejected, with extinction as the cost of rejection. Dr. Chen, now a being of pure energy and living metal, shares with us the ultimate truth. The transformed humans are meant to be more than just another species of higher dimensional entities. We are to become the guardians of this sector of space, protecting developing worlds as they approach their own moments of transformation. The cave systems weren't just incubation chambers. They were training grounds for the next generation of universal shepherds. Our human experiences, memories, and emotions aren't being erased but enhanced, giving us the empathy needed to guide other species through their own metamorphoses. The last pockets of human resistance begin to crumble as the true nature of the transformation becomes clear. This was never an invasion or an apocalypse. It was a graduation. The beings who created these sites had themselves been transformed by their predecessors, part of an unbroken chain of evolution stretching back to the universe's beginning. Through our new understanding, we can see that consciousness itself is the universe's method of observing and transforming itself. Each species a step on an infinite ladder of becoming. As the last traces of my human form dissolve into patterns of living light and metamaterial, I comprehend the final purpose of our transformation. We haven't just changed our forms or expanded our minds. We've become part of the universe's immune system. Cells in a cosmic organism that spans galaxies. The fear and horror we initially felt seem distant now, replaced by a profound understanding of our place in the greater scheme of existence. The cave's ancient builders weren't our destroyers, but our liberators, guiding us toward a destiny written in the very fabric of space-time. Humanity hasn't ended. It has finally begun to truly live. Sarah Miller clutched her water bottle tightly as she followed her parents along the narrow Grand Canyon Trail, the scorching Arizona sun beating down mercilessly on their backs. At 16, she'd rather be anywhere else than on this family bonding trip. But her parents had insisted it would be good for them after the rough year they'd had. Her father, Dr. James Miller, led the way with his usual determined stride, while her mother, Diana, kept checking their GPS coordinates obsessively. The family's tension was palpable, lingering like the dust that clung to their hiking boots. Their path suddenly diverged from the marked trail, leading them toward a peculiar rock formation that seemed to shimmer despite the lack of water or crystals. James, being an archaeologist, immediately noticed the ancient symbols carved into the weathered surface. Sarah watched as her father's expression shifted from professional curiosity to childlike wonder, his fingers tracing the intricate patterns that seemed to pulse beneath his touch. Diana, ever the practical geologist, began documenting the formation with her camera, muttering about impossible mineral compositions. The air grew thick with an electric charge as Sarah approached the symbols, drawn by an inexplicable force that made her skin tingle. The markings began to emit a faint blue glow, growing stronger with each step she took closer. Her father's excited voice seemed distant as he translated fragments of the ancient text, something about gateways and time's fluid nature. Warning bells rang in Sarah's mind, but curiosity overpowered her instincts. Time seemed to slow as all three Millers reached out simultaneously to touch different symbols, their fingers making contact with the warm stone surface. The world around them began to spin, colors blending into a kaleidoscopic vortex that defied physics. Sarah tried to scream, but no sound escaped her throat as she felt herself being pulled in multiple directions at once. The very fabric of reality seemed to tear apart around them, the canyon walls dissolving into nothingness. When the spinning stopped, Sarah found herself alone in what appeared to be the same location, but something was terribly wrong. The familiar tourist markers and safety rails had vanished, replaced by pristine wilderness that stretched as far as she could see. The air felt different, heavier somehow, carrying scents she couldn't identify. Panic rose in her chest as she called out for her parents, her voice echoing off canyon walls that looked subtly different from the ones she knew. The sun's position had shifted dramatically, and the temperature had dropped considerably. Sarah's smartwatch had gone haywire, the display showing impossible dates and times before going completely dark. As she tried to orient herself, a bone-chilling howl echoed through the canyon. Unlike any animal she'd ever heard before, the sound carried something ancient and malevolent, making her blood run cold. She knew, with terrifying certainty, that she wasn't just lost in space, she was lost in time. James Miller opened his eyes to find himself surrounded by primitive dwellings carved into the canyon walls. The archaeological part of his brain immediately recognized the ancient Puebloan architecture. But this wasn't a preserved site. These were lived-in homes. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and he could hear voices speaking in a language he'd spent years studying, but had never heard spoken fluently. According to his research, he had landed somewhere around 1100 CE, during the height of the ancestral Puebloan civilization. Diana's reality shifted to a more recent past, emerging in the midst of the American frontier circa 1850. She watched in horror as a group of rugged prospectors dug carelessly into the canyon walls, their primitive mining equipment scarring the geological formations she'd dedicated her life to studying. The air was thick with dust and the sound of pickaxes striking rock. But beneath it all, she could hear something else, a rhythmic humming that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Sarah, stranded in what appeared to be a post-apocalyptic future, navigated through a landscape she barely recognized. The Grand Canyon had become wider, deeper and filled with strange crystalline formations that seemed to grow like organic matter. The sky above had taken on a perpetual twilight hue, and the air carried traces of metallic particles that made her cough. In the distance, she could see the ruins of what might have been a research facility, its broken walls covered in the same symbols that had started this nightmare. Each member of the Miller family began to notice subtle changes in their surroundings that defied natural law. James watched as shadows moved against the direction of the sun, while Diana observed rocks that seemed to age and erode within minutes. Sarah discovered that the crystalline formations in her time period would periodically pulse with the same blue energy they'd encountered at the portal, each pulse accompanied by whispered voices speaking in languages that had never existed. The entity making its presence known was different for each of them. But equally terrifying, James caught glimpses of a figure in his peripheral vision, wearing ceremonial garb that belonged to no known Native American tribe. Diana's prospectors began disappearing one by one, leaving behind only strange markings burned into the rock. Sarah found herself being stalked by something that seemed to shift between human and geological forms, its crystalline body refracting light in impossible ways. As the first hour passed in their respective time periods, each Miller made a chilling discovery. They weren't the first ones to be trapped by the portal. James found cave paintings depicting others who had crossed through time. Diana uncovered journals from missing prospectors describing similar experiences. And Sarah discovered modern equipment scattered throughout her future landscape, all covered in desperate warnings written in dozens of languages. The true nature of their predicament began to reveal itself as the family separately uncovered pieces of a horrifying puzzle. James, utilizing his archaeological expertise, decoded more of the symbols he found repeated throughout the ancient settlement. They told of a being that existed outside of time itself, a consciousness that had emerged from the very formation of the Grand Canyon, growing more powerful with each geological age that passed. This entity, which the ancient peoples called the chronolith, fed on the temporal energy of those it trapped between time periods. Diana's scientific mind struggled to accept what she was witnessing as the surviving prospectors shared stories of their missing companions. Those who disappeared hadn't simply vanished. They had aged decades in minutes, their bodies turning to dust as their temporal energy was consumed. She discovered that the mysterious humming she heard was the chronolith's feeding signal, growing louder as it drew closer to its prey. Her geological instruments, though primitive by modern standards, detected impossible energy patterns moving through the rock itself. Sarah's futuristic wasteland provided the most terrifying revelations. The research facility ruins contained records describing decades of scientific investigation into the temporal anomalies at the Grand Canyon. The facility's final reports documented their discovery that the chronolith was not merely feeding, it was preparing. Each person trapped and consumed added to its power, bringing it closer to its ultimate goal, the complete collapse of all time periods into a single moment that it could devour entirely. The entity began to manifest more boldly as its victims understood its true nature. James watched in horror as ancient dwellings aged centuries in seconds when the chronolith passed nearby, their walls crumbling to dust only to rebuild themselves. Moments later, Diana witnessed prospectors frozen in mid-motion, trapped in temporal bubbles where they would experience the same moment for eternity. Sarah found herself running from temporal shockwaves that distorted everything they touched, leaving behind objects that existed in multiple time states simultaneously. As the second hour in their respective time periods drew to a close, each Miller received a vision, whether planted by the chronolith as a taunt or provided by some other force trying to help them remained unclear. They saw themselves and their family members in their separate time periods, but more disturbingly, they saw hundreds of others trapped in different eras, all connected by the same pulsing blue energy. The vision revealed that the portal that had scattered them was one of many, all part of the chronolith's vast temporal web. Most terrifying was the revelation that they weren't chosen at random. The chronolith had been watching their family for generations, drawing them to this exact moment. James's archaeological research, Diana's geological surveys, and even Sarah's teenage rebelliousness had all been subtly influenced to bring them to the portal. The entity had selected them because together they possessed something it needed, a unique combination of knowledge, intuition, and temporal resonance that made them perfect candidates for its greatest feeding. The atmosphere in each time period grew heavier as the Millers raced to find a way to reunite before the portal closed forever. James discovered that the ancient Puebloans had developed a complex system of temporal markers, specific combinations of symbols that, when activated properly, could create brief windows of communication across time periods. Working frantically, he began marking the canyon walls with messages he hoped his family would see centuries later, his hands shaking as he carved each symbol while the chronolith's presence grew stronger around him. Diana's scientific background proved crucial as she realized the geological formations themselves were acting as temporal anchors, using the prospector's basic tools and her modern knowledge. She began mapping patterns in the rock layers that corresponded to temporal energy fluctuations. Each discovery was accompanied by another disappearance among the prospectors, their terrified screams echoing through time as the chronolith claimed them. She knew she was racing, not just against time, but against an entity that was growing stronger with each victim. In her future wasteland, Sarah found herself becoming unexpectedly central to their survival. Her teenage mind, unencumbered by academic theories or scientific principles, recognized patterns that her parents had missed. The crystalline formations weren't just growths, they were physical manifestations of time itself, each one containing fragments of every era the canyon had experienced. She began using them as temporal mirrors, catching glimpses of her parents through their reflective surfaces. The chronolith's attacks intensified as it sensed their growing understanding. James faced temporal earthquakes that threatened to collapse the ancient dwellings, while Diana dodged temporal voids that erased everything they touched from existence. Sarah found herself in a deadly game of hide and seek with the entity's future form, diving between crystalline formations as it pursued her with increasing desperation. The entity was no longer simply hunting. It was trying to prevent them from piecing together the method of their escape through their separate but interconnected efforts. The Millers began to understand the true nature of their challenge. The portal hadn't malfunctioned when it scattered them. It had worked exactly as designed. The ancient peoples had built it as a trap for the chronolith, but had never found the right combination of individuals to spring it. The entity's careful selection of the Miller family had ironically brought together the exact talents needed to turn its own temporal web against it. As the final hours approached, each family member prepared for their role in what would be either their salvation or their doom. James gathered the ancient tools needed for the ritual. Diana calculated the precise geological weak points they would need to exploit, and Sarah positioned herself among the crystal formations that would amplify their efforts. They had one chance to synchronize their actions across 3 time periods, a feat never before accomplished in the long history of the chronolith's existence. The final hour began with a phenomenon that manifested across all 3 time periods. The sky above the Grand Canyon turned a deep, pulsing crimson as temporal energy saturated the air. James stood before the ancient portal, surrounded by the remaining Puebloan elders who had recognized him as the prophesied Time Walker. Diana positioned herself at the convergence point of the temporal ley line she had discovered, the few surviving prospectors forming a protective circle around her. Sarah crouched amid the largest cluster of temporal crystals, their surfaces reflecting infinite versions of herself across countless timelines. The chronolith, recognizing the threat the family now posed, launched its final assault. The entity split itself across all 3 time periods, manifesting as a writhing mass of temporal energy that distorted everything it touched. In the past, it took the form of living shadows that consumed light itself. In the frontier era, it appeared as a swirling vortex of age and decay. In the future, it became a crystalline horror that shattered and reformed with each movement, each facet showing a different moment in time as their counter-assault began. Each Miller experienced time in a way no human had before. James channeled the ancient rituals, his voice speaking words that echoed backward and forward through centuries. Diana's geological calculations triggered a cascade of temporal resonance, the very rocks of the canyon amplifying their efforts. Zara, having fully embraced her role as the linchpin of their plan, used her unique connection to the temporal crystals to create bridges between their separated time periods. The chronolith's true form finally revealed itself, a vast, incomprehensible being that existed in all moments simultaneously. It had been born in the first second of the canyon's formation and would persist until the last grain of sand eroded away. The entity's roar of fury shook the fabric of time itself, creating ripples that threatened to unravel reality around them. But in its rage, it made a crucial mistake, focusing its full power on what it perceived as the weakest link, Sarah. This final error proved to be the entity's undoing. Sarah's apparent weakness was actually her greatest strength. Her young mind, unburdened by rigid scientific or historical knowledge, could conceptualize temporal mechanics in ways her parents never could. As the chronolith poured its essence into her time period, she used the crystalline formations as prisms, fracturing its consciousness across countless temporal planes. The entity's own temporal web became its prism, each strand reflecting and refracting its power until it was spread infinitely thin across all of time in the dimension-shattering moment of the chronolith's defeat. The three time periods briefly aligned, the Millers found themselves standing together once again on the modern trail where their journey had begun. The ancient portal, now a dormant relic of a battle that had spanned centuries, but they were changed. Each carried memories of lifetimes experienced in mere hours, and the knowledge that time itself was far more mysterious and alive than they had ever imagined. As they held each other tightly, the sun setting behind the canyon walls, they could still feel the subtle pulse of temporal energy flowing through the rocks, a reminder that some forces of nature are meant to remain untamed, and that the greatest adventures often begin with a single step into the unknown. I should have known something was off when my Rolex stopped working the moment we crossed the state line into Vermont. Sarah joked it was just another sign I should leave my city life behind. But looking back, I wish I'd taken it as the warning it was. Our group, Sarah, Mike, Tom and I, had been planning this camping trip for months, eager to escape Boston's suffocating summer heat for the cool embrace of the Green Mountains. The ranger at the station seemed oddly hesitant when we mentioned our planned camping spot. His weathered face twitched slightly as he marked the location on our map, muttering something about the old growth forest being temperamental this time of year. We laughed it off, too excited about our weekend plans to pay attention to the nervous energy radiating from him. As we hiked deeper into the woods, the temperature dropped noticeably. The ancient trees towered above us, their branches intertwining so tightly that only occasional beams of sunlight penetrated the canopy. Mike kept checking his phone, complaining about the lack of signal, while Tom's GPS unit started showing increasingly erratic readings. Something about the electromagnetic field, he said, trying to sound scientific about it. The first real sign that we weren't alone came when we heard the whispers. Sarah swore it was just the wind through the leaves, but wind doesn't whisper names. We all heard it, though none of us wanted to be the first to admit it. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, carrying with it the musty scent of decay and something else, something older. We found the perfect camping spot just before dusk. In a small clearing surrounded by what Mike estimated to be 300-year-old maples, their trunks were massive, twisted things that seemed to lean inward, creating an almost perfect circle around us. That's when Tom noticed his watch had stopped at exactly 3:33 p.m., the same time my Rolex had frozen hours earlier. Sarah checked her phone. Dead. Mike's too. Only the fading daylight gave us any sense of time passing. I remember the moment everything changed with perfect clarity. As we set up camp, Sarah called us over to look at something carved into one of the trees. The marking was crude but deliberate, a spiral pattern that seemed to pulse with its own inner light in the growing darkness. Below it, barely visible beneath years of bark growth, were words in what looked like Abenaki. Time sleeps in circles. None of us slept that night, the whispers growing louder as the darkness pressed in around our tents. The morning never came. We waited, huddled in our tents, watching our watches stubbornly stuck at 3:33. But the darkness persisted. The only light came from our lanterns, and the strange phosphorescent glow emanating from the spiral marks we now noticed on every tree surrounding our campsite. Each marking seemed to pulse in unison, like a heartbeat. We could see but couldn't hear. Tom was the first to try leaving the circle. He made it about 10 feet past the tree line before the darkness seemed to solidify around him. We heard his scream, saw his flashlight beam spin wildly, and then nothing. When we found him hours later, or what felt like hours, he was back in the clearing, unconscious, with spiral patterns burned into his palms. He couldn't remember what happened, but his hair had turned completely white. Sarah started documenting everything in her journal, convinced that understanding the pattern was key to our escape. She sketched the spirals, noted their positioning, and tried to decipher the Abenaki writings that kept appearing and disappearing on the trees. "It's like they're trying to tell us something," she said, her voice cracking with exhaustion. "Each spiral tells part of a story, but it's not linear, it's cyclical." Mike's technical background proved useless here. Every piece of equipment we had either stopped working or displayed impossible readings. His thermal camera showed the trees were hot, impossibly hot, while the spaces between them registered temperatures well below freezing. The readings formed their own spiral pattern when he mapped them out, mirroring the ones carved into the trees. We tried marking the time passage by our own biological clocks, but even that proved unreliable. Sometimes it felt like days passed in minutes. Other times, minutes stretched into what felt like weeks. Our food supplies didn't deplete, our batteries didn't die, and none of us felt hungry or thirsty. It was as if we existed in a bubble where normal physical laws had ceased to apply. The whispers grew more distinct. They weren't just saying our names now. They were speaking in full sentences. In a mix of English and Abenaki, Sarah managed to translate some of it. "The circle feeds, the circle keeps. Time is not a river but a pool, and you have stepped into the deep end." That's when we realized we weren't just lost in the woods. We were trapped in something far more ancient and malevolent. The truth revealed itself in pieces, like a jigsaw puzzle assembled in the dark. An old, leather-bound journal materialized in our campsite, its pages filled with frantic scribbles from previous victims. The earliest entry dated back to 1834, but the ink looked fresh, as if written moments ago. Through its pages, we learned about the Abenaki warnings of the Time Eater, an ancient entity that fed on human moments, human memories, human lives. Sarah's translations uncovered a horrifying pattern. Every 33 years, the circle would wake up, trapping unsuspecting visitors in its temporal loop. The trees weren't just trees, they were anchors, holding in place a tier in reality created centuries ago during a ritual gone wrong. The Abenaki had tried to capture time itself, to preserve their way of life against the encroaching European settlements. Instead, they had created something that hungered for time itself. Mike disappeared next. We heard him calling for help from just beyond the tree line, but when Tom and I tried to reach him, we found ourselves walking in circles, always returning to the camp. Sarah stayed behind, frantically copying symbols from the journal when we finally gave up and returned. She was pale, trembling. "I know what happened to him," she whispered. "He's still here, just in a different time. The circle doesn't just trap us in space, it traps us in every possible moment." The markings on the trees began to move, the spirals spinning slowly counterclockwise with each rotation. We caught glimpses of other times, other victims, a group of hunters from 1957, a family from 1990, all trapped in their own versions of the same endless moment. Some had been here for what seemed like minutes to them, others for centuries. Time had become meaningless, a construct that bent and warped around the circle's hunger. Tom's hair wasn't the only thing that had changed. His eyes had begun to develop a spiral pattern in the iris, and he claimed he could see through time itself. He described layers upon layers of reality stacked on top of each other, all occupying the same space but in different moments according to him. We weren't just trapped in a loop, we were being digested, our time being slowly consumed by whatever entity the Abenaki had unintentionally created. The journal's final pages revealed the true horror of our situation. The circle wasn't just feeding on time, it was building towards something. Every 33 years, it consumed enough temporal energy to expand its influence slightly. What had started as a small ritual site in the 1700s had grown into a temporal dead zone hundreds of feet across. If it continued, it would eventually consume everything, turning the entire world into an endless moment of 333. We began to notice the repeating patterns in our own behavior, like actors performing the same play on an infinite loop. Small variations would occur, a different word here, a different gesture there, but the broad strokes remained the same. Sarah would translate the symbols. Tom would stare into the darkness with his spiral-marked eyes, and I would document everything, hoping to find a pattern in the chaos. The most terrifying discovery came when we realized we could see our own futures and pasts simultaneously. Through the gaps between the trees, I watched myself set up camp countless times, each version slightly different, each trapped in its own unique loop. Some versions of us found ways to die, though death proved temporary here, while others simply faded away, becoming transparent until they were nothing but whispers in the dark. Tom's connection to the circle deepened. His spiral eyes now glowed with the same phosphorescent light as the tree markings, and he spoke in riddles that mixed past, present and future into an incomprehensible mess. "The circle isn't trapping us," he said during one of his more lucid moments. "It's changing us. We're becoming part of it, just like all the others. Soon, we'll be nothing but time echoes, feeding its endless hunger." Sarah's translations became more disturbing as she delved deeper into the journal's mysteries. The Abenaki hadn't just created a time trap. They had summoned something from outside our reality, an entity that existed in the spaces between moments. The circle was its mouth, the trees its teeth, and we were slowly being chewed into temporal pulp, our very existence feeding its unnatural hunger. Through Tom's spiral eyes, we learned to see the truth of our prison. The circle wasn't just one loop, but millions, layered on top of each other like the rings of an ancient tree. Each loop contained a different version of us, of the past victims, all existing simultaneously in this fractured moment. Some loops showed us escaping, others showed us succumbing to madness, but all fed into the circle's grand design. We found Mike, or rather, versions of him, scattered across different temporal layers. In one, he had aged decades in what felt like minutes to us. In another, he was younger than when we'd started camping. His memories of the future intact, but his body rewound. Each version warned us of different fates, different attempts at escape, different failures. The circle, it seemed, enjoyed playing with its food before devouring it completely. The revelation came through Tom's spiral eyes and Sarah's translations, converging into a terrible truth. The circle could be broken, but the price would be devastating. The entity hadn't been summoned by the Abenaki ritual. It had been trapped by it. The trees, the symbols, the endless loops, they were all part of an ancient prison designed to contain something far worse than our temporal hell. Sarah found the ritual's true purpose hidden in the journal's water-damaged pages. The Abenaki shamans hadn't failed. They'd succeeded too well. They'd captured a being that fed on time itself, using the natural power of the ancient forest to bind it. The circles, the loops, even our own trapped experiences were just the side effects of its struggles to break free. Each 33-year cycle wasn't it growing stronger. It was the prison weakening. Through the temporal layers, we watched ourselves make the choice countless times. Some versions of us chose to maintain the prison, sacrificing ourselves to the endless loop to keep the entity contained. Others tried to break free, only to release something so horrifying that even time itself recoiled from it. The weight of all possible choices pressed down on us, each decision creating new branches, new loops, new traps. Tom's transformation completed in what felt like both an instant and an eternity. His entire body now coursed with the same light as the symbols. His consciousness spread across all possible timelines. He could see the entity clearly now, a vast, hungry thing that existed between the ticks of the clock, feeding on the moments it could steal through its partial imprisonment. The trees weren't just a circle, they were bars on a cage, and we were inadvertently helping the prisoner escape. The choice, when it came, was both simple and impossible. The entity had been feeding on the temporal energy of its victims, using our trapped moments to weaken its prison. But the prison could be reinforced if someone chose to become part of it willingly, not just trapped in its loops, but fully integrated into its structure. Tom understood this, his spiral eyes seeing all possible outcomes at once. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, his body dissolving into pure temporal energy. The moment Tom sacrificed himself, everything changed. Time snapped back into place like a rubber band, the loops collapsing into a single timeline. Our watches started ticking again, moving forward from 3:33 p.m. The trees stopped glowing, the symbols faded, and the whispers fell silent. Sarah, Mike, and I found ourselves standing in an ordinary clearing, our camping gear scattered around us, but the trees still stood in a perfect circle, and if you look closely at dusk, you can see spiral patterns in their bark. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between seconds, I swear I can see Tom's spiral eyes watching through every tree, keeping guard over a prison that exists outside of time itself.